Hey everybody, Tim here, welcoming you to the Chicago and Northwestern Harvard Subdivision in N-Scale. I realized it's been almost 2 years since I started this channel, and that I haven't really done an overview of this project since moving to the new house, and I had started construction on the current version of the layout. So this week, I'll be going through the backstory, what my overall plan for the layout is, where the progress is right now. That way, folks that are newer to the channel and have really only gotten to hear my weekly construction updates have a better sense of what my overall vision is and what I'm trying to do with the layout. So, for those that aren't familiar with the layout or the railroad that I'm modeling, the actual Chicago Northwestern got its start back in 1859, and over the decades, through expansion and mergers, built itself into a pretty decent sized Midwest railroad. It was, for a period of time, it was the eastern partner for Union Pacific's famous passenger trains, and in 1935 it introduced its own famous passenger train, the 400, which was so named because the first version of the 400 ran from Chicago to the Twin Cities, which was about 400 miles in 400 minutes. Unfortunately, around that same time, the Northwestern had some financial problems, especially during the war period, and it went into bankruptcy for a while. But during that peak diesel era, especially in the 50s, the Northwestern built an impressive commuter operation. In fact, by the 60s, it was the only profitable passenger operation of any of the major private railroads. They actually invented the cab forward push pull operations that are still seen on commuter lines like Metra across the country. And over the period, they absorbed other railroads like the Omaha Line, the Chicago Great Western, and eventually even the Rock Island's Spine Line to grow and expand. But even as it expanded, it remained frugal to a fault, gaining the reputation for being the cheap and nothing wasted railroad. That frugal budget and minimal cash flow would ultimately kind of lay the groundwork for its undoing, because in the 1970s, the Northwestern was one of two railroads that was in a position to access the highly sought after Powder River Basin coal in Wyoming. The only problem was that its line across Nebraska that could potentially get there, which was called the Cowboy Line, was in such terrible shape that there was no way that they could run coal trains over the Cowboy Line. And it would have taken hundreds of millions of dollars that, frankly, the Northwestern didn't have to renovate the line and get it up to spec. So the CNW turned to a different solution, and that solution was to form a partnership with the Union Pacific. So basically, UP would allow the Northwestern to run its coal traffic across the UP main line, across Nebraska, before hopping onto the CNW main line in Fremont, Nebraska, and then through Iowa over into Illinois. So in the short term, while that got CNW the access that it needed, it also set up the stage for its ultimate demise, because the Northwestern essentially became more and more intertwined or interconnected with the Union Pacific. And after they fended off a possible takeover by an investment firm in the late 80s, the Union Pacific ultimately acquired the Northwestern in 1995. So in real life, the Northwestern has been a fallen flag for almost 30 years at this point. But the beauty of model railroading is we don't have to rigidly follow the timeline. We can deviate slightly. So kind of like what we saw famously in the Avengers movies, what if I just tweak one moment in time and set us down a modified timeline where the Chicago Northwestern still exists in the 21st century and is doing quite well. So in the world of my layout, the critical difference is that the Northwestern acquired the Milwaukee Road in 1964, which was something they actually came very close to doing in real life. That's not just a made-up event. That was actually something they were pursuing. And in the 1970s, instead of scrapping the Pacific extension like the actual Milwaukee Road did, because the Northwestern owns it, they decide instead they're going to modernize it so they can keep using it. And they make this decision just in time for the gas crisis as a result of the Middle East oil embargo to hit the United States in the 1970s. And as the only Western railroad that's not wholly dependent on diesel, the Northwestern's profits soared through this time period. And with plenty of funds available then, they build a line directly into the Powder River Basin on their own. They don't need to partner with the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific, they also go in a different direction. They acquire the Rock Island, so that way they get their direct connection into Chicago, which again in real life was something the UP really had been aggressively pursuing and trying to do. So I'm operating my layout similar to the famous Utah belt in that my plan is to constantly move the timeline forward. And so I'll be updating rolling stock, I'll be retiring certain locomotives, I might even adjust scenery as needed. Now, to give companies time to make the models that I need, though, my layout is set kind of 10 years in the past with a clock rolling forward. So right now, on the layout, it's September of 2013 instead of September of 2023. So in the world of the layout, the big project that the Chicago Northwestern is working on right now, the official title is the NWHSL, the Northwestern Higher Speed Line. So when Congress passed ERA in 2009 after the housing crisis, it included significant money for rail development. So Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota all approached the Chicago Northwestern about building a public-private partnership so they could create a high-speed line between Chicago and the Twin Cities, essentially resurrecting the famous 400 of old. Now, the federal government would never award grants for a rail line that would compete with Amtrak service. So using the original 400 route, which goes through Milwaukee, was not going to be an option because Amtrak has a pretty robust Hiawatha service that provides multiple daily trains between Chicago and Milwaukee. So as a result, they select the Harvard subdivision for its low freight traffic, and basically essentially the main competitor on the Harvard sub is just daily metro trains. So the new route will run from Chicago through Janesville and then through Madison up to the Twin Cities. So construction begins in 2009, and the plan is to construct the full upgraded high-speed capable line over 3 phases. Phase 1 essentially gets the line up to Janesville. Specifically, the plan is to grade separate after Crystal Lake to allow the trains at that point to go above 100 miles an hour. By February of 2012, the route is complete up to Madison, and the Northwestern, at the request of the Wisconsin and Illinois governments, starts running trains that terminate in Madison while they work on finishing up the remaining third phase of construction to get them up to the Twin Cities. The trip from Chicago to Madison is just under 2 hours, even with a stop at Janesville, and critically, that's more than 30 minutes faster than if someone were to do that trip by car, so ridership grows pretty quickly. I wanted to build the layout in N scale because I want to be able to see, close to prototypical length trains running through quite a bit of scenery. The layout sits in a roughly 16 by 16 foot space and also partially takes up an unfinished storage room as well. The layout will be 2 levels and it will run point to point. Each level represents roughly 4 miles of the actual Harvard subdivision. The first level runs from just east of Arlington Heights Station to just before the Palatine Station. The second level runs from the town of Crystal Lake through the town of Ridgefield. The gap between those 2 segments is covered by the travel time through the helix, which means when I'm operating trains at close to prototypical speeds, they run almost perfectly on time compared to their real-life counterparts. Each level has roughly 54 feet of mainline run, so even though it is point-to-point, with a staging yard, with a stub-ended staging yard on each level, with more than 100 feet of mainline plus the helix, the trains have plenty of track to run through without having to stop. Construction on the layout began in June of 2023 after we moved into our new house at the end of May of this year. After the staging yard was built, I cut the holes in the wall and began building the benchwork for the layout proper. I'm using open grid benchwork, keeping it pretty simple. I'm mounting it directly into the studs of the wall, and obviously legs on the front for bracing and further support. I had to build a lift out because I needed to keep that free to get access to the back storage room because we've got refrigerators and other storage back there beyond just my train stuff. And I'm currently working on scenery for the first area just to help break up the monotony of constantly just doing bench work and track laying and wiring. It's nice to kind of change up which aspect of the hobby I'm working on. Main construction is on pause at the moment because the next phase of the layout build, which will add roughly 14 straight feet of mainline once it's done, requires that I first build a brand new wall, get a wall framed to cover the gap that you see in this part of the basement. In part, I'm building a wall because I'll have to build a multi-level swing gate so that way people can get in and out of the layout area. That's a bit trickier than just building the open grid benchwork that I've done so far, so I'm going to be bringing in some folks to help me out with that part of the project. In the meantime, while I wait to do that, I've got plenty of other work to do, adding more backdrop, more fascia, further developing the scenery. Now, once it's done, or once it's done enough that I can start really running trains more than just a few feet, operations will consist of running several daily metro trains, handling the 2 locals that serve industries on the modeled portion of the layout, and then there will be several through freights that travel up and down the Harvard sub, in addition to the high-speed 400 trains that will be moving in and out of the layout. The goal is to have the first level built by the end of this year. To allow for some decent operations with only the first level ready, I'll be building some staging tracks next to where the helix will go, so that way trains have kind of a western terminus to where they can stop at, rather than just stopping, on the layout itself. And that's basically the backstory and the plan for the layout in a nutshell. If this sounds cool to you, please tune in as I post updates pretty much every week on how layout construction is going. You're in on this project very early, as there's a lot more to build, and I appreciate everyone's support as I continue to expand the Harvard sub to its full size. Stay tuned for the next regular update, and I can't wait to show you what's going to be worked on next.